My son handed me the keys to a dusty old garage and told me it was my inheritance while he kept our multi-million-dollar family home. He gave me just 48 hours to pack up 40 years of my life, treating me like I was a piece of trash he was taking to the curb. He was so smug, so sure he had all the power. But what he didn't know was the secret my late husband left hidden for me inside that garage. A secret that would lead to the most perfect, satisfying revenge you could ever imagine. The leather of the chair was cold against my back, a stark contrast to the oppressive LA sun baking the city through the panoramic window of the lawyer's office. 40 floors below, the world buzzed on oblivious. My own world had stopped turning 3 weeks ago, the day I lost Leonard. Now it felt like it was being systematically dismantled. Jeremy's arm was a heavy weight on my shoulders. It was meant to be comforting, I suppose, but it felt more like an anchor holding me in place while the tide of my life went out. He was performing the role of the grieving son beautifully, his face a mask of solemnity, but I could feel a thrum of anxious energy radiating from him. The lawyer, a man whose suit probably cost more than my first car, droned on in that dispassionate tone they must teach in law school. I wasn't really listening. I was just trying to breathe. Then a few words cut through the fog. To my beloved son, Jeremy McCarthy, I bequeath the penthouse property at 1 Century Drive, along with all its art furnishings and contents. I felt more than heard the tiny, sharp intake of breath from Jeremy. It was the sound of a man who had been holding his breath for a very long time. A wave of relief so potent, it was almost a physical force shuddered through his body and down the arm that held me captive. The lawyer cleared his throat. And to my beloved wife, Helen McCarthy, he continued, and my heart gave a painful lurch. I bequeath the industrial garage property located at 412 Elm Street and all of its contents. Silence. The kind of silence that's so loud it rings in your ears. A garage. While Jeremy got our home, our life, our memories, I was left with Leonard's dusty old hobby space. Jeremy finally broke the stillness, squeezing my shoulder in a gesture that felt entirely false. He told the lawyer and everyone that it was just like his father, so thoughtful. He leaned in his voice, a stage whisper, meant for me but audible to all, saying that Dad knew I'd want something simple, something without the stress of managing a large property. He said it with such conviction, as if he were praising a wise and benevolent king, instead of a man who had just posthumously made his wife of 40 years homeless. The shift was immediate. The moment we left that office, the performance was over. Jeremy's grief evaporated, replaced by a chilling efficiency. He told me on the ride back to what was no longer my home that he needed to prepare the asset for market evaluation. Asset. That's what our home had become. He gave me 48 hours, 2 days, to pack up 4 decades of a life, a marriage, a family. His wife Amanda sat in the passenger seat, nodding along to his pragmatic reasoning, her eyes already mentally swapping out my antique furniture for something more modern, more sterile. My shock, my grief, my utter bewilderment, it was all an inconvenience to them, a sentimental roadblock on their new highway to wealth. The next 2 days were a blur of cardboard boxes and ghosts. Every object I touched screamed with a memory of Leonard. His favorite reading chair, the chipped mug he always used for his morning coffee, the photo of us in Italy, young and foolish and so in love. I packed what I could into a few boxes, my entire existence condensed into a small, pathetic pile by the front door. A sleek black car, a service Jeremy had ordered, came to collect me. I didn't even get a goodbye. He was on a conference call in his study, already inhabiting his new role as Lord of the Manor. Amanda gave me a thin, pitying smile as the driver loaded my boxes into the trunk. The ride was silent. I watched the familiar gleaming towers of Century City recede in the rearview mirror, replaced by the low-slung, gritty landscape of the city's industrial heart. The car stopped in front of a roll-up metal door on a desolate street. The building was a featureless block of stained concrete. This was it. This was my inheritance. The driver, a kind-faced man who refused to meet my eye, unloaded my boxes onto the grimy sidewalk and drove away, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence. The air inside was thick with the smell of old oil, cold concrete, and decades of neglect. It was cavernous and dark, the only light filtering through a few grimy windows high up on the walls. The space was filled with hulking, shapeless forms draped in dusty tarps. I ran a hand over one, the canvas stiff and gritty beneath my fingers. This was what I had been reduced to, a relic stored in a dusty garage among my husband's other forgotten projects. The heavy metal door slid shut behind me with a deafening clang of finality. A wave of despair so profound it buckled my knees washed over me. I was 67 years old, a widow, and utterly, totally worthless. I had been discarded. I don't know how long I sat there on an old wooden crate in the gloom. An hour a day. Eventually, a numb sort of autopilot took over. I saw a box stacked near a workbench, one of the few things not covered by a tarp. It was an old banker's box with Leonard's familiar scrawl on the side, "Office." Probably old tax returns, forgotten paperwork. I opened it, my hands moving mechanically, sorting through files without really seeing them. My fingers brushed against something hard and cool. I pulled it out. It was a heavy, ornate key, the kind you'd see for a vintage car, attached to a simple, worn leather fob. Tucked beneath it was a small, folded piece of notepaper. My heart ached as I recognized his handwriting. I unfolded it. 5 short words and a postscript. For my Helen, the real engine is always hidden. And then underneath, P.S., the joke's on Jeremy. The words made no sense. It felt like a final cryptic love note from a man I suddenly felt I hadn't known at all. My mind was too clouded with grief and shock to process it as anything more. A joke. My life had just been shattered, and he was talking about a joke. A fresh wave of tears came hot and bitter. I clutched the key and the note in my hand, a tangible piece of him in this cold, empty place. It was confusing and heartbreaking, but it was all I had left. I slipped them both into my pocket, a final puzzling memento from the man I had lost twice over. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now, let's get back to it. The first few days in the garage were a gray, formless blur of grief. Time didn't seem to pass in any meaningful way. I survived on the few snacks I had in my purse and water from a rusty tap in the corner, my world having shrunk to the 4 dusty walls of my inheritance. The profound sense of being discarded was a physical weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe, let alone think. But even the deepest grief can't last forever. Eventually, a tiny, insistent flicker of something else pushed through the numbness. Curiosity. I found myself pulling the heavy key and Leonard's note from my pocket again and again, the paper growing soft from the constant touch. The real engine is always hidden. The words still felt like a puzzle with no solution, but they were his words. And in that desolate place, they were all I had. My eyes scanned the gloomy space and landed on a large gray metal cabinet in the corner, secured with a heavy-duty lock. It looked like it held spare parts, maybe old tools. On a whim born of sheer boredom and a desperate need for a distraction, I walked over. The key slid into the lock with a satisfying, well-oiled click. The heavy door swung open. not with the clang of loose tools, but with the quiet sigh of balanced hinges. The shelves inside weren't filled with wrenches and oily rags. They were lined with meticulous leather-bound ledgers, each one embossed with a year. I pulled one out, the leather cool and smooth beneath my fingers. I opened it to the first page. The script was elegant, precise. It was an entry for a 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO. It detailed the car's entire history notes on a recent restoration, and at the bottom, a contact, M. Sterling, Sterling Automotive Curations. My heart gave a little flutter. This was something different. This was organized, professional. This wasn't a hobby. Finding the number for the business online with my phone felt like a monumental effort. My hands were trembling so much I had to dial it 3 times. A man answered with a calm, deep voice. I explained my own voice, barely a whisper, that I was settling my husband Leonard McCarthy's estate and had found a note about a Ferrari. There was a long pause on the other end, a silence so profound I thought he might have hung up. Then he spoke, and his tone had shifted. It was now filled with a deep, unmistakable respect. He told me his name was Sterling, and then he said the words that changed everything. He said, "Mrs. McCarthy, we have been waiting for your call." He explained my husband was a dear friend and a vital client. And then he added that he believed they were holding several of his assets. For me, assets. Plural. Before I could even process what that meant, he offered to come to me, insisting it was no trouble at all. An hour later, a classic, elegant sedan pulled up outside, and a man in his late 60s stepped out. He was tall and distinguished with kind eyes that held no pity, only a quiet sort of empathy. He introduced himself as Martin Sterling. His respectful demeanor was like a balm on my raw, bruised spirit. I showed him the ledger, and his eyes widened slightly. He nodded, a small, knowing smile on his face. He asked if I knew what else was in the garage. I just shook my head, gesturing vaguely at the shapes under the tarps. He walked over to the nearest one, a long, low silhouette, and with a gentleness that was almost reverent, he took a corner of the heavy canvas. He pulled it back. The dust fell away to reveal the sleek, powerful frame of a vintage Aston Martin, its silver paint gleaming even in the dim light. It was breathtaking. I just stared, speechless. He turned to me, his expression serious, but kind. He explained that my husband wasn't just a man who liked to tinker with old cars. Leonard, my quiet, unassuming Leonard, was a silent, revered titan in the world of classic car collecting and restoration, operating through a network of shell companies to build one of the most significant private portfolios in the country. He told me this garage wasn't just a storage space. It was the heart of the operation. It wasn't a paltry inheritance left out of spite or neglect. It was the headquarters of an empire. And he said, looking right at me, it was all mine. The shock of that revelation didn't wear off for days. It was like being struck by lightning. The world looked the same, but everything was fundamentally, irrevocably different. My grief for Leonard was still a constant, aching presence, but now it was tangled up with a profound sense of wonder. This was his last great secret, his final elaborate act. I spent my days in the garage, but the space itself transformed around me. The oppressive gloom was replaced by a quiet hum of purpose. Mr. Sterling became my patient, steady guide. He treated me not as a fragile old woman, but as the new head of the firm, and that respect alone was a powerful tonic. My life became a strange apprenticeship. I learned a new language, a vocabulary of carburetors, chassis numbers, and provenance. I pored over the ledgers, and the columns of numbers and notes began to tell a story not just of business, but of my husband's passion. I learned which cars were the workhorses, the steady investments, and which were the divas, the rare temperamental masterpieces. While my son believed I was huddled in the dark, a poor, discarded widow, I was quietly being educated. I was learning the mechanics of my own power. We made sure the illusion held. I still wore my simple clothes, and Mr. Sterling would bring me groceries in unassuming paper bags. To any casual observer, he was just a kind old friend checking in on a grieving woman. No one knew he was briefing me on multi-million-dollar transactions. It was during one of these briefings that Mr. Sterling gently brought up my son. He told me in his discreet way that the circles he moved in were small and that whispers traveled fast. The word was that Jeremy's latest tech venture had not just failed, but imploded, leaving a trail of furious investors. He said that Jeremy was selling the penthouse not out of ambition, but out of sheer clawing desperation. It clicked into place. The cruelty, the speed of my eviction, it wasn't just greed. It was panic. He wasn't just claiming a prize, he was trying to plug a hole in a sinking ship. That knowledge hardened something in me. My mission became clear. It was time to stop learning and start acting. Mr. Sterling arranged a series of secure video calls introducing me to the other two pillars of my husband's secret empire, a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer named Anita and a quiet financial wizard named David. They had been waiting just as Mr. Sterling had. They showed me the full extent of the operation, the network of holding companies, the offshore accounts, the brilliant, complex web Leonard had woven to protect his assets. My first official act was to authorize the private sale of a lesser-known Porsche in the collection. The influx of cash gave us an operating budget, and with it, I instructed Anita to form a new primary holding company under my exclusive control. We named it LM Enterprises. My final directive was for Mr. Sterling. I told him to begin the final preparations on the 1962 Ferrari. It was time to put our crown jewel on the world's biggest stage, the Sotheby's auction, in 2 months. While I was moving pieces around a global chessboard in secret, Jeremy was playing checkers for a public audience. I saw it online on one of those insufferable luxury lifestyle blogs Amanda was so fond of. There was a splashy article about the McCarthy heir, listing his iconic family penthouse. Jeremy was quoted extensively talking about legacy and moving into a new era. The photos showed him looking tanned and successful, posing in the living room I had decorated. He was so consumed with selling the glittering cage he had stolen, so focused on the image he was projecting to the world, that he had completely forgotten about me. He was making the most critical mistake a person can make. He had underestimated his opponent. He had no idea that the discarded old woman in a worthless garage was quietly preparing to demonstrate what the word legacy really meant. The day we filed the injunction was quiet. There was no fanfare, no dramatic pronouncement. Anita, my lawyer, simply made a call, and a digital file was sent. An invisible arrow had been loosed, and all I could do was wait for it to land. I spent the morning in the garage, which had become my sanctuary and my headquarters. The space was transformed. The grime was gone, replaced by polished concrete floors. The hulking tarp-covered shapes were now revealed as automotive works of art in various stages of restoration, gleaming under new bright workshop lights. I was at a large custom-built workbench reviewing financial projections with David when I heard the squeal of tires outside. I didn't need to look up. I knew that sound. It was the sound of panic. The garage door rattled as it was thrown open, slamming against its stops. Jeremy stood there silhouetted against the bright afternoon sun, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. He looked like a wild animal, his expensive suit rumpled, his hair a mess. His eyes darted around the transformed space, taking in the clean, organized workshop, the priceless machinery, the two calm, well-dressed professionals at my side. He looked at me, truly, looked at me for the first time since the will was read, and the confusion on his face was warring with the fury. He saw not a broken victim huddled in the dark, but an executive in charge. He finally found his voice, and it was a raw scream. He demanded to know what this was, what I had done. He waved his phone in the air, probably displaying the email from his realtor that had shattered his world. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I met his furious gaze and let the silence hang in the air for a moment before I spoke. I told him calmly that a company called LM Enterprises had placed a lien on the penthouse. His face contorted. He spat the name out, asking who it was. This was the moment. The culmination of Leonard's plan and my own quiet resolve. I told him that LM Enterprises was mine. Leonard McCarthy Enterprises. Then I delivered the final fatal blow. I explained that the penthouse I was afraid had been purchased in 1998 with seed money from this business. It was an asset of my company, Jeremy, not yours. The finality in my voice broke him. It was as if I had reached into his chest and pulled out his spine. The rage dissolved, replaced by a wave of pure abject terror. His last lifeline was gone, and he shattered. The confession came pouring out of him in a torrent of rage and self-pity, his words punctuated by ragged, ugly sobs. He told me everything: the failed tech company, the lies to his investors, the crippling multi-million-dollar debt. He was personally liable for the threats he was receiving. He paced the floor of my workshop, weeping and blaming everyone but himself, the market, his partners, even his father, for putting him in this position. It was the pathetic, whining monologue of a spoiled child who had finally been handed a bill he couldn't pay. I listened to the entire tirade without a word. I felt no pity, only a vast, cold distance. When his sobs finally subsided and he stood there spent and broken, he looked at me with the desperate eyes of a boy looking for his mother to fix everything. I offered him no comfort. I offered him no forgiveness. I simply looked at him and told him that he had made a terrible mess for himself. I informed him that the Sotheby's auction for the Ferrari was in 2 weeks, and that was a business event. His problems, I said, were a personal matter. Then I turned my back on him. I returned to my seat at the workbench, picked up my pen, and went back to my work, dismissing him as completely and utterly as he had dismissed me. I left him standing alone, a powerless, weeping ghost in the middle of the very empire he had so carelessly thrown away. The 2 weeks leading up to the auction were a whirlwind of quiet, focused activity, but I barely registered them. My mind was already there in that glittering room, waiting for the final act to play out. When the night finally arrived, I felt a strange sense of calm, the kind that comes after a storm has passed and you're left to survey the new landscape. The auction house was exactly as I'd imagined, a cathedral of wealth, all hushed tones, soft lighting, and the electric buzz of money in the air. This was the social apex, the glittering world my son had been so desperate to conquer. And in the center of it all, under a dozen spotlights, sat the 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO. It wasn't just a car. It was a legend, a piece of art. And tonight, it was my instrument. I arrived not as a grieving widow, but as the owner. I had chosen my outfit with care, a simple but exquisitely tailored suit in a deep charcoal gray. Power, I had learned, doesn't need to shout. I walked in, flanked by Mr. Sterling on one side and Anita, my lawyer, on the other. We were a portrait of quiet authority. Heads turned. Whispers followed in our wake. Men, whose names were whispered in boardrooms across the country, nodded to me with a newfound deference. They weren't just being polite to an old woman. They were acknowledging the mysterious Mrs. M, the new formidable player who had emerged from the shadows of the McCarthy portfolio. I was in control. I had found my footing in this strange new world. The auctioneer took his podium. A hush fell over the room as he began his introduction for the star of the evening. This was the moment. And just as he was about to open the bidding, there was a commotion near the back of the room. A frantic, disheveled figure was pushing his way through the crowd, ignoring the polite attempts of the staff to stop him. It was Jeremy. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes wild with a desperation that was painful to watch. He looked like a man who had been running for weeks. He broke through the final line of attendees and stumbled to a halt in front of my table. The room was silent. Every eye was on us. He looked at me, and his voice was a desperate, cracking whisper that carried in the stillness. He begged me, calling me Mom, a title he had long since forfeited the right to use with any meaning. He pleaded with me not to do this, to give him just a piece of it, telling me and the entire room that he was ruined. He was trying to invoke a relationship he himself had set on fire, hoping to find some ember of pity in the ashes. I looked at my son, the man who had discarded me without a second thought, and I felt not anger, but a profound and sorrowful finality. This was the end of a story that had begun long before the will was ever read. I spoke, my voice not loud, but clear and steady enough for the surrounding tables to hear every single word. I told him he had already received his inheritance. You chose walls and windows, Jeremy. My husband left his legacy, his passion, his life's work to me. Then I broke his gaze and turned to the auctioneer who stood frozen at his podium. I gave a small, deliberate nod. Please proceed. The judgment was absolute, and it was delivered not by me, but by the silent collective stare of the room. The shocked, disdainful looks from the very people Jeremy had spent his life trying to impress were the daggers that finally, publicly destroyed the fragile image he had curated. The auctioneer, taking his cue, slammed his gavel down. "The bid starts at $20 million, he boomed. The room erupted in a flurry of raised paddles and escalating numbers. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of my new life beginning. And in the center of it all, Jeremy stood alone, a social ghost completely and utterly erased. The sound of the final gavel was less a bang and more a shift in the universe. The Ferrari sold for $48 million. In the days that followed, the story of that night became a piece of Los Angeles lore, the tale of the mysterious McCarthy portfolio, the public meltdown of the arrogant heir, and the stunning emergence of his quiet, dignified mother. The fallout for Jeremy was swift and brutal. I heard about it in snippets from Anita and Mr. Sterling, who tried to shield me from the worst of it. His bankruptcy was a public spectacle. The penthouse was seized by creditors, and the entire fragile structure of his life, built on a foundation of lies and entitlement, was systematically dismantled. His wife Amanda was one of the first to leave, vanishing from the LA social scene as quickly as she had appeared. And Jeremy, he just disappeared. Stripped of his name, his status, and his fair-weather friends, he was erased from the world he had fought so desperately to inhabit. I heard he was forced to take some menial job in a city I'd never heard of. There was a part of me, the mother in me, that felt a deep and abiding sorrow for the boy I had raised. But he was a man who had been given every advantage and had made every wrong choice. He was now living with the consequences he had built for himself brick by brick. My own life, in contrast, was just beginning. The immense wealth was staggering, but I knew I couldn't simply retreat into a life of quiet luxury. That would be a betrayal of Leonard's true legacy. His passion wasn't about hoarding value. It was about creating it. So with the proceeds from that first auction, I established the Leonard McCarthy Foundation for Artisanal Craft. My garage, once a symbol of my despair and loneliness, was thrown open. We brought in state-of-the-art equipment and the best veteran mechanics as instructors. We created scholarships and apprenticeships for a new generation of artisans. Young men and women with grease under their fingernails and a fire in their eyes who loved the feel of metal and the smell of a finely tuned engine. The garage became a vibrant, thriving hub of learning and creativity, filled with the sounds of machinery, laughter, and purpose. About a year later, I was in the middle of that beautiful, controlled chaos. I was in practical coveralls, a streak of grease on my cheek, laughing as I helped a gifted young female apprentice named Maria tune the engine of a vintage Porsche. My hands, once accustomed to the delicate pages of library books, were now steady and capable as they worked with wrenches and wires. I was surrounded by noise, purpose, and life. Mr. Sterling walked over, a small smile on his face, and handed me a piece of mail that had arrived. It was a simple, worn postcard, the picture a drab motel on a lonely stretch of highway. I turned it over. The handwriting was messy, almost childlike, but I recognized it instantly. On the back were 2 words: "I'm sorry." I studied it for a long moment, the sounds of the bustling workshop fading into the background. A flicker of an old familiar sadness touched my heart, the ghost of the son I had lost, the life we might have had. But then it was replaced by a wave of serene strength. I had built a new life from the ashes of the one that had been taken from me. I placed the postcard on my workbench next to a schematic for a V12 engine. Then I turned back to Maria, my hands steady, and got back to work. In the end, the story of Helen and Jeremy became a quiet lesson on the nature of true wealth. Jeremy had chased the glittering facade of status, the penthouse, the public image, the performance of success. But his inheritance was a hollow shell built on a foundation of debt and desperation. He was left with nothing because he valued nothing of substance. Helen, on the other hand, was given what seemed worthless, a dusty garage and a broken heart. Yet within that forgotten space, she found the real engine of her husband's life, his passion, his legacy, and ultimately her own strength. She learned that true power isn't in a skyline view, but in building something real with your own 2 hands. Her victory wasn't just revenge, it was a profound act of rediscovery.